March 9, 1945, 11:47 p.m., Tokyo. The night air hung thick with the scent of charcoal braziers and miso soup simmering in 10,000 kitchens. Across the Sumida River, in the warren of wooden homes that pressed shoulder to shoulder through Asakusa and Fukagawa, families huddled beneath quilted futons, their breath visible in the late winter cold. The blackout curtains were drawn. The sirens had been silent for hours. In the imperial palace, where cherry blossoms would bloom in 3 weeks, staff officers reviewed intelligence reports by candlelight, their faces cast in shadow. Outside, the city exhaled, a collective sigh of temporary reprieve. The Americans had not come tonight, or so it seemed. 13,000 feet above the Pacific, a different kind of breath was being drawn. 334 silver giants, each weighing 74 tons fully loaded, droned through the darkness in formations so vast they blotted out the stars. Inside the pressurized cabins, young men from Kansas and Oregon and Alabama checked their oxygen masks and watched fuel gauges with the intensity of card players studying their final hand. They had been briefed 3 times. They knew the target. They knew what they carried. In the lead aircraft, Pathfinder, Brigadier General Thomas S. Power sat behind the pilot, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the instruments glowing green in the cockpit darkness. Below them, the Japanese home islands lay invisible beneath scattered clouds, a civilization of paper and wood that had dismissed these very aircraft as impossible fabrications. Propaganda designed to demoralize a warrior nation that had never known defeat on its own soil. The Empire of Japan was about to learn the difference between propaganda and truth. For 3 years, whispers of the B-29 Superfortress had drifted through Japanese military intelligence like smoke. The Americans, it was said, had developed a bomber of unprecedented size, a 4-engine colossus capable of flying higher, faster, and farther than any aircraft in existence. It could carry 5 tons of ordnance across 2,000 miles. It possessed pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled defensive guns, and a cruising altitude that placed it beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters. To the analysts in Tokyo, sequestered in their wood-paneled offices beneath the War Ministry, these specifications seemed fantastical. The Americans, they reasoned, were a nation of Hollywood illusions and advertising slogans. They built automobiles with chrome and radios that played jazz. They did not build instruments of war that could challenge the divine wind protecting the emperor's realm. The first photographic evidence arrived in June 1944. Grainy reconnaissance images of massive aircraft on Chinese airfields. Japanese intelligence officers studied the photographs with magnifying glasses, measuring wingspans against known landmarks, calculating payload capacities and fuel consumption rates. Some concluded the images were doctored. Others argued the aircraft were prototypes, experimental machines that would never reach operational status. A minority report, filed by a young lieutenant colonel who had studied engineering at Stanford before the war, suggested the B-29 represented an industrial capability beyond Japan's capacity to counter. His report was noted and filed. No action was taken. The reasoning was rooted in experience and ideology. Japan had fought the Americans in China, in the Philippines, in the island chains scattered across the Pacific like stepping stones to empire. They had seen American equipment, adequate, sometimes impressive, but nothing that suggested a fundamental advantage. American tanks were lighter than German panzers. American rifles were semi-automatic but no more accurate than the Arisaka Type 99. American destroyers were fast but vulnerable to torpedo attack. The notion that America could design and mass-produce a strategic bomber that rendered obsolete every principle of air defense developed by the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force seemed less a military assessment than a surrender to enemy mythology. There was something else, too, something deeper than tactical analysis. The Japanese military establishment, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and 2 generations of industrial modernization, had constructed an identity around discipline, sacrifice, and material efficiency. Japanese soldiers marched on rice and pickled radish. Japanese pilots flew aircraft built from aluminum and determination, every rivet placed by conscientious hands, every engine assembled with precision that bordered on reverence. The idea that America could simply outproduce Japan, could overwhelm discipline with abundance and precision with sheer volume, violated every principle that defined Japanese military culture. To acknowledge the B-29 as real was to acknowledge that the war might be decided not by courage or tactics, but by factories in Detroit and steel mills in Pittsburgh, places Japanese officers had never seen and could scarcely imagine. So they dismissed it. Intelligence reports were downgraded. Sightings were attributed to reconnaissance aircraft or misidentified bombers. When B-29s began flying missions from Chengdu, China in June 1944, attacking steel plants in Kyushu, the damage was acknowledged, but the strategic implications were not. These were raids, not a campaign, isolated strikes, not a prelude. The Americans were testing, they were probing, they were not, could not be, preparing to burn Japan from the sky. The crews who climbed into those 334 superfortresses on the evening of March 9, 1945, carried no such illusions. They had trained for 18 months first in Kansas wheat fields, where the B-29s looked like they belonged to a future war, then in India and China, and finally on Guam, Tinian and Saipan Islands, seized at terrible cost. Transformed in months into the largest bomber bases in history. They had flown daylight precision raids at 30,000 feet, dropping explosives on aircraft factories and refineries, while Japanese fighters clawed up through thin air to meet them. They had watched bombers spiral down in flames, had counted empty spaces in formation where friends had flown the day before. They had learned that precision bombing from 6 miles up was a theory that looked better in briefing rooms than it performed over hostile territory. Now they were trying something different. The B-29s flew low tonight, 5,000 feet, then descending to 7,000, some as low as 5,000. They had stripped out most of their defensive armament, removed the gunners and the ammunition, torn out everything that wasn't essential to the single purpose of carrying the maximum possible payload to Tokyo. Each aircraft was loaded with E-46 incendiary cluster bombs, cylinders packed with jellied gasoline that would burst on impact, scattering burning gel across wooden structures that had never been designed to resist fire. The total payload exceeded 2,000 tons. It was enough ordnance to level a city. But first it had to reach the target. At 12:15 a.m., the Pathfinder aircraft crossed the Tokyo coastline. Below, the city sprawled like a circuit board, darkness punctuated by scattered lights that the blackout regulations couldn't entirely suppress. Air raid sirens began their wail, a sound that had become routine over 3 years of war, a sound that usually signaled a brief drill or a single reconnaissance flight. Citizens rolled over in their sleep. Some rose and gathered children shuffling toward designated shelters. Most stayed in bed. The sirens were crying wolf again. Then the first incendiaries fell. They came down in clusters, tumbling through the night like terrible rain. When they struck rooftops, streets, wooden walls still warm from dinner fires, they burst into bloom. Not the orange-red of natural flame, but a white-hot chemical inferno that clung to whatever it touched. Within seconds, a dozen fires ignited in Asakusa. Within minutes, 100. The Pathfinders had marked an X across the densest residential districts, and now the main force followed, wave after wave, opening bomb bay doors and releasing their loads with mechanical precision. The crews saw it from above, watched as individual fires merged into larger blazes, as larger blazes coalesced into firestorms. The heat rose in columns so intense they created their own weather, updrafts that tossed the B-29s like toys. Turbulence so violent that navigators were thrown against the fuselage, oxygen masks ripped from faces. Tailgunners looking back toward the target saw a sight that would haunt them for decades. Tokyo transforming into a sea of flame and inferno so bright it reflected off the undersides of clouds 40 miles away. So hot that paint peeled from aircraft flying at 7,000 feet. One bombardier, a 23-year-old from Nebraska named Robert Morgan, wrote in his diary 12 hours later, "We could smell it at altitude." burning wood and something else, something sweet and terrible that I didn't want to identify. The entire city was a furnace. We had created hell on earth. On the ground, hell had indeed arrived. The firestorm generated winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, typhoon-force gales that sucked oxygen from the air and turned streets into blast furnaces. Wooden homes, packed together with inches between walls, ignited in sequence like matches in a box. The fire moved faster than people could run. Families fleeing down narrow alleys found themselves trapped between walls of flame, turned back again and again until there was nowhere left to turn. The Sumida River, normally a sluggish waterway crossed by 17 bridges, became a destination for thousands who believed water would save them. They were wrong. The river itself seemed to boil. Bodies floated downstream, steaming in the superheated air. In the industrial district of Fukagawa, a mother pressed her 3 children against the stone wall of a warehouse, covering them with her body as the air itself caught fire. When workers found them the next morning, they had been carbonized into a single sculpture of ash that crumbled at the touch. In Hanzhou, a group of 30 schoolchildren followed their teacher into a concrete cistern, seeking refuge from the flames. The firestorm consumed the oxygen inside. They were found days later, perfectly preserved, suffocated without a burn on their bodies. The numbers emerged slowly, compiled by surveyors who walked through 16 square miles of ash and twisted metal. The official estimate, filed by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department on March 19th, listed 83,793 dead. The actual number was certainly higher. Bodies had been vaporized, entire families erased without trace. 15% of Tokyo's total urban area had ceased to exist. Over 1 million people were homeless. The industrial capacity that had supported Japan's war machine, the small workshops and cottage industries that produced everything from rifle parts to radio components, had been reduced to slag and cinder. In Washington, General Curtis LeMay received the damage assessment reports with grim satisfaction. LeMay, who commanded the XXI Bomber Command from Guam, had staked his career on the low-altitude incendiary strategy. Precision bombing had failed to cripple Japanese industry. Now he would burn the factories and the workers' homes simultaneously, would destroy the will to produce and the means of production in a single stroke. The firebombing of Tokyo was not an aberration. It was a template. In the weeks that followed, LeMay's bombers would incinerate Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, every major city except Kyoto, which was spared for cultural reasons, and 4 targets reserved for a new weapon then in development. The strategic logic was brutal and effective. If Japan's industry was dispersed through residential neighborhoods, then residential neighborhoods would burn. The Japanese High Command received the reports in silence. There was no denying the destruction now, no dismissing the B-29 as propaganda or prototype. 334 aircraft had crossed. The Pacific had flown through the night at altitudes. Japanese fighters could barely reach, had delivered 2,000 tons of ordnance with industrial efficiency, and had returned to their bases with losses of 14 aircraft. A 4.2% attrition rate that was operationally sustainable for an air force that could replace bombers faster than Japan could shoot them down. In the wood-paneled conference room beneath the War Ministry, where maps of the Pacific were marked with shrinking circles of Japanese-held territory, the reality settled like snow on a grave. The Americans had not merely built a bomber. They had built an air force of bombers. They had constructed the infrastructure, the runways, the fuel depots, the repair facilities, the housing for crews on islands that had been Japanese 6 months earlier. They had done it with a speed and scale that revealed an industrial capacity beyond calculation. Every B-29 that appeared over Tokyo represented an economy that could produce aluminum and engines and electronics and train pilots and build airfields while simultaneously fighting a 2-front war across 2 oceans and supplying allies in Europe and Asia. A Japanese staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Shigeharu Aseda, wrote in his private journal on March 15th, "We have been fighting an idea of America, an America of weakness and decadence that existed only in our briefings. The real America has now introduced itself through fire. It is not weak. It is not decadent. It is industrial capitalism armed and unleashed, and we have nothing in our tradition or our arsenal that can answer it. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. Japanese civilians who had been told since 1941 that the war was proceeding according to plan, that sacrifices were temporary, that victory was inevitable, now stood in ash that had been their homes and understood that something had gone terribly wrong. The government's response, a mixture of censorship, exhortation to greater sacrifice, and construction of firebreaks that would prove meaningless against future raids, convinced no one. The propaganda machine that had sustained morale through defeat after defeat in the Pacific now ground against a reality too large to spin. The emperor himself, touring the ruins of Tokyo on March 18th, stood silent before the devastation. His advisors waited for a pronouncement, a statement that could be distributed to rally the people. He said nothing. What was there to say? The divine wind had not protected the capital. The warrior spirit had not stopped the bombers. All the ideology and tradition and disciplined sacrifice that defined the Japanese way of war had proven inadequate against an enemy who waged war like an industrial process, methodical, scalable, unstoppable. Among the B-29 crews, the reaction was complicated. They were young men, mostly, 22, 24, 26 years old. They had joined the Air Force to fight, to contribute, to serve. They believed in the cause, defeating fascism, ending Japanese aggression, avenging Pearl Harbor. But sitting in debriefing rooms on Guam, drinking coffee from tin cups, and describing what they had seen over Tokyo, many found the words didn't come easily. "We'd burned a city," a navigator named James Patillo told a reporter 2 weeks later. "We killed more people in 6 hours than died in some battles that lasted months. I don't feel guilty. The Japanese started this war, and we're finishing it. But I don't feel proud either. I feel like we crossed some line, like we invented a new kind of war that nobody will be able to uninvent." He was right. The firebombing of Tokyo was a watershed, a demonstration that strategic bombing had evolved from attacking military targets to destroying the capacity and will of an entire nation to wage war. The distinction between soldier and civilian, between military target and home front, had been rendered obsolete by incendiary technology and long-range aviation. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 5 months later, they were merely an extension of a strategy already proven over Tokyo. Bring the war home, make it unbearable, force surrender through the systematic destruction of urban centers. But there was something else at work in that firebombing campaign, something beyond strategy and tactics. The B-29 itself had become a symbol, not just of American air power, but of American civilization. Every Superfortress was a cathedral of aluminum and electronics, a machine so complex it required 50,000 man-hours to build, so sophisticated it employed technologies Japan could barely understand. The pressurized cabins, the remote-controlled gun turrets, the analog computers that calculated bomb site trajectories, the radial engines that produced 2,200 horsepower each. These were not merely weapons. They were artifacts of an economy and a society organized around principles fundamentally different from Japan's. Japanese pilots who managed to intercept B-29s at altitude described the experience with a mixture of professional respect and existential dread. The Superfortresses flew in defensive formations called boxes, mutually supporting, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns that filled the sky with tracer fire. A fighter pilot attacking a B-29 formation entered a three-dimensional kill zone where survival depended on split-second timing and extraordinary skill. And even when attacks succeeded, even when a B-29 went down smoking and trailing fire, 3 more would appear the next day and 3 more the day after that. An endless production line turning out weapons faster than Japan could destroy them. A Japanese fighter ace, Captain Yasuhiko Kuroe, who survived the war with 11 B-29 kills, reflected in a 1952 interview, "We could shoot them down, but we couldn't defeat them. They represented something larger than aircraft. They represented Ford Motor Company and Boeing and the Pittsburgh steel mills. We were fighting an assembly line, and assembly lines don't feel pain or fear or exhaustion, they just produce. By May 1945, the B-29 campaign had destroyed 43% of 63 Japanese cities. The industrial districts were gone. The railways were wrecked. Food distribution had collapsed. School children were evacuated to the countryside, where they grew thin on radish soup and millet. The government issued instructions for civilians to fight with bamboo spears when the American invasion came, instructions that everyone understood were fantasies, a last gesture of defiance against the inevitable. The B-29s continued their missions. On clear days, they flew at 30,000 feet, untouchable, almost leisurely, their contrails etching white lines across the blue sky. On cloudy days, they came low, following radar guidance to targets they would never see. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was increasingly sporadic, limited by ammunition shortages. Fighter interceptions became rare as fuel supplies dwindled. The Emperor's subjects learned to recognize the sound of Wright R-3350 engines throbbing at altitude, a sound that meant terror was approaching, but that could not be defended against, only endured. In the Mariana Islands, where the B-29 bases sprawled across Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, mechanics worked around the clock to maintain the bomber fleet. It was grueling work. Each mission exposed engines to temperatures and stresses that would destroy a civilian aircraft in hours. Spark plugs fouled, hydraulic lines ruptured, propeller pitch mechanisms failed. But the maintenance crews, many of them barely 20 years old, kept the bombers flying. They understood perhaps more clearly than the brass in Washington that the war was being won not by heroism or tactics, but by logistics, by the ability to keep 300 aircraft operational, to deliver spare parts from factories in California to runways in the Pacific, to train replacement crews faster than combat, claimed them. A crew chief named Daniel McCarthy, who maintained B-29s on Tinian, wrote to his father in March 1945, "I work 16-hour days, 6 days a week. I haven't seen a movie or a baseball game in 4 months. But every time I watch one of my planes take off at sunset, loaded with 10 tons of bombs, I know I'm putting nails in the Emperor's coffin. These aircraft are democracy in aluminum, built by free men, maintained by free men, flown by free men, and they're going to win this war one sortie at a time." That was the symbolism the Japanese high command had failed to grasp. The B-29 was not merely an aircraft, it was the physical manifestation of a political and economic system that mobilized resources through voluntary cooperation rather than imperial command. The workers who built B-29s in Kansas were paid wages, not coerced by military police. The engineers who designed them worked for corporations competing for contracts, not government ministries dictating specifications. The pilots who flew them had volunteered for service, believing in a cause larger than obedience. Japan had constructed its war machine through discipline, hierarchy, and national mobilization. America had constructed its war machine through capitalism, innovation, and industrial competition. In 1945, over the smoking ruins of Tokyo, it became clear which system produced more bombers. On the morning of March 10th, as dawn light filtered through smoke that would linger for 3 days, survivors wandered through the ashes of Asakusa, searching for landmarks that no longer existed. The Buddhist temple where families had worshipped for generations was a foundation of scorched stone. The market where merchants had sold fish and vegetables since the Meiji era was a field of debris. The primary school where children had learned calligraphy and mathematics had vanished so completely that only the outline of its foundation remained, scorched into the earth like a shadow. An elderly man, a retired schoolteacher named Takeshi Nakamura, stood where his house had been and tried to reconstruct the rooms from memory. Here was the entrance where his daughter had greeted him each evening. There was the kitchen where his wife had prepared miso soup every morning for 40 years. Beyond, the small garden where his grandson had played with wooden toys. All of it was ash now. All of it had been consumed in 6 hours by weapons dropped from aircraft the government had insisted didn't exist. He thought about the intelligence reports, the dismissals, the propaganda that had reassured the public that Japan's air defenses were impregnable. He thought about the junior officers who had filed warnings and been ignored. He thought about the ideology that had valued discipline over flexibility, tradition over adaptation, belief over evidence. And he understood, standing in the ash that had been his life, that Japan had not merely lost a battle or a city. It had lost a confrontation between competing visions of modernity, and had discovered too late that conviction and courage were no substitute for factories and bombers and the industrial capacity to wage total war. Nakamura was not alone in this realization. Across Japan, in cities that had not yet burned but knew their turn was coming, citizens began to whisper questions that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Why had the government not prepared for this? Why had the generals assured them that American bombers could not reach Japan? Why were they being asked to sacrifice everything for a war that was clearly, undeniably lost? These whispers reached the ears of the emperor's advisors, who compiled reports and presented them to His Majesty in private audiences. The reports spoke of declining morale, increasing war weariness, a growing recognition that continued resistance would result only in more cities burned, more families destroyed, more children orphaned. They spoke, in carefully coded language, of a population losing faith not just in the war, but in the institutions that had led them into the war. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima and released a weapon that made the firebombing of Tokyo seem almost conventional. The atomic bomb vaporized the city center, killed 80,000 people instantly, and introduced humanity to a new era of warfare. 3 days later, another B-29 dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio address that most Japanese people heard for the first time. His voice thin and reedy, speaking in formal court language that many could barely understand, but conveying a message that was unmistakable. The war was over. In the aftermath, as occupation forces arrived and Japanese society began the painful process of reconstruction, historians and military analysts attempted to understand how a nation that had dominated East Asia for a decade had been defeated so completely. The explanations were numerous: strategic overreach, inadequate resources, industrial deficiencies, errors in command. But beneath all these factors lay a more fundamental miscalculation: the belief that spirit could overcome material, that ideology could defeat production, that a warrior nation's discipline and sacrifice could prevail against an industrial democracy's capacity to build weapons in quantities that rendered qualitative differences meaningless. The B-29 had been dismissed as propaganda because acknowledging it as real meant acknowledging that Japan's entire strategic calculus was based on false assumptions. It meant admitting that American industrial capacity was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that could not be matched. It meant recognizing that a society organized around individual freedom and economic competition could, when threatened, mobilize resources more effectively than a society organized around hierarchy and command. These were not lessons the Japanese High Command wanted to learn. So they dismissed the reports, downgraded the intelligence, assured themselves and their emperor that the B-29 was a phantom, a propaganda tool, a desperate fabrication by a decadent enemy that lacked the will to fight. And then, 334 of those phantoms appeared over Tokyo in a single night and burned 16 square miles of the city to ash. In the years after the war, survivors of the March 9th firebombing would gather annually at memorial sites throughout Tokyo. They would light incense, offer prayers for the dead, and share memories of that night when the sky itself seemed to catch fire. Some spoke of miracles: the child pulled from rubble, the family that found shelter in a concrete cistern, the Buddha statue that survived intact amid total devastation. Others spoke of horror: the sound of buildings collapsing, the smell of burning flesh, the sight of the Sumida River choked with bodies. But almost all spoke of a single, overwhelming impression: the realization as dawn broke on March 10th and they stood amid the ruins of their city that they had been lied to. The government had told them Japan was winning. The military had assured them that the home islands were protected. The emperor's ministers had promised that the divine wind would preserve them from harm. All of it had been false. All of it had burned away in 6 hours, leaving only truth in the form of ash and smoke and the distant drone of bombers returning to their bases. An elementary school teacher named Kimiko Watanabe, who survived by sheltering in a concrete water tower, would write in her memoir 40 years later, the B-29s did not just destroy buildings. They destroyed the lies we had been told, the myths we had believed. When I emerged that morning and saw what had been done to Tokyo, I understood that we had been fighting an enemy we didn't understand, with weapons we didn't possess, for reasons that no longer mattered. The B-29 was not propaganda. It was truth delivered from altitude, a truth we had refused to believe until it fell on us like fire from heaven. That truth, delivered across 16 square miles of Tokyo in 2,000 tons of incendiaries, revealed the fundamental dynamic of the Pacific War. Japan had fought with courage and skill and absolute conviction. Its soldiers had died by the hundreds of thousands defending positions that could not be held. Its pilots had flown suicide missions against warships they could not sink. Its civilians had endured starvation, bombardment, and loss with a stoicism that commanded respect even from their enemies. But none of it had been enough. Because on the other side of the Pacific was a nation that built B-29s, the way Japan built bicycles, methodically, efficiently, in vast quantities. A nation that trained crews in Texas and Kansas and sent them across 8,000 miles of ocean to deliver destruction with assembly line precision. A nation that, when precision bombing proved insufficient, developed incendiary tactics that turned wooden cities into furnaces. A nation that, when incendiaries proved insufficient, developed atomic weapons and deployed them without hesitation. This was the America that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as propaganda. Not the Hollywood America of movies and advertising, but the industrial America of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. A civilization that had mechanized agriculture, automated manufacturing, and applied engineering principles to every aspect of human activity, including warfare. When that civilization turned its attention to defeating Japan, it did not send samurai to fight samurai. It sent bombers, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, and it kept sending them until there was nothing left to bomb. On a spring evening in 1946, as cherry blossoms bloomed over the rebuilding ruins of Tokyo, a former Japanese intelligence officer named Takeshi Yamamoto sat in a tea house that had somehow survived the firebombing. He was working as a translator for the American occupation forces, a job that required him to explain Japanese culture to foreigners who had, a year earlier, been dropping incendiaries on his city. It was strange work, humbling work, but it paid enough to feed his family. An American major, a pilot who had flown B-29s over Tokyo, joined him for tea. They had developed a careful friendship, these former enemies, built on mutual respect and the shared experience of having witnessed history's cruelty. The major asked a question he had been wanting to ask for months. Why had Japanese intelligence dismissed the B-29 as propaganda for so long? Yamamoto considered the question carefully. He thought about the briefings he had attended, the reports he had filed, the assumptions that had shaped Japanese strategic thinking. He thought about the ideology that had insisted spirit could overcome material, that discipline could defeat abundance, that a warrior nation could prevail against an industrial democracy. Finally, he answered, "We dismissed the B-29 because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that we had already lost." The aircraft itself was not just a weapon. It was proof that America possessed capabilities we could not match. Every B-29 represented 1,000 workers in a factory, 100 engineers in a design bureau, a dozen pilots in training, a logistics system that spanned the Pacific. To accept the B-29 as real meant accepting that we were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity was so vast, so overwhelming, that our courage and our casualties and our sacrifices would never be enough. It meant accepting that modern war is not won by warriors, but by factories. And that was a truth we could not face until 334 of your bombers made it impossible to deny. The major nodded slowly. He thought about the missions he had flown, the cities he had helped burn, the war he had helped end. He thought about the B-29s lined up on Tinian, gleaming in the tropical sun, each one a masterpiece of engineering and an instrument of destruction. He thought about the factory workers in Kansas who had built them, the maintenance crews who had kept them flying, the civilization that had produced them. "We didn't want to burn your cities," he said quietly, "but we wanted the war to end, and the B-29 was the tool we had." Yamamoto smiled sadly. The B-29 was not just a tool, it was a message. It told us that we were fighting the future, and the future could not be defeated with swords and spirit. It told us that the world had changed, that industrial capacity mattered more than warrior tradition, that abundance was stronger than discipline. We didn't want to believe that message, so we called it propaganda, until the night it burned Tokyo. Then we believed. The story of the B-29 and the firebombing of Tokyo is often told as a tale of strategic bombing, of tactical innovation, of the brutal calculus that ends wars through destruction. But it is also a story about belief and reality, about the danger of dismissing uncomfortable truths as propaganda, about the consequences of mistaking ideology for strategy. Japan's high command dismissed the B-29 not because they lacked intelligence or insight, but because accepting its existence meant accepting an entire worldview they had spent decades rejecting. It meant acknowledging that American capitalism, which they viewed as chaotic and decadent, could outproduce Japanese discipline. It meant recognizing that individual freedom, which they saw as weakness, could generate innovation that military command could not match. It meant admitting that the future belonged not to warrior traditions, but to industrial modernity. So they called it propaganda. They downgraded the reports. They reassured themselves and their emperor that the Americans were bluffing, that the specifications were exaggerated, that the threat was manageable. And then, on the night of March 9, 1945, 334 silver bombers crossed the Tokyo coastline, opened their bomb bay doors, and delivered a truth that could not be denied: the age of the samurai was over. The age of the B-29 had begun. And in the confrontation between tradition and modernity, between ideology and industry, between conviction and capacity, there was no contest. The fires that consumed Tokyo that night burned more than wood and paper. They burned illusions. They burned assumptions. They burned the mythology that had sustained Japan's war effort and revealed in the harsh light of a 6-hour inferno. The reality that had been there all along, that modern war is won by those who can build the most machines, train the most crews, deliver the most ordnance, and that calling those machines propaganda doesn't make them disappear. It only delays the moment when they appear overhead, silver and unstoppable, carrying fire.